You're listening to Accounted For, the Canadian podcast that explores the intangibles of every career. I'm your host, Daniel Lee. Hey everyone, welcome back to Accounted For. This is a podcast on a mission to expand your perspectives, have you question your default option, and get inspired to action for your own career. And thank you for giving me your time on this wonderful Wednesday. Happy hump day. And if you're listening that on a day that is not a Wednesday, no problem. That's the point of having a podcast. It's 100% on demand. This podcast is part of OMD Ventures. That is my platform with a mission to build utopian organizations by unlocking human potential. And this podcast is all part of making that mission come true. So if you want to check out more about the platform and what it stands for and all the other kind of media products I've created, check it out at omdventures.com or alternatively oldmandan.com. I own both domains. As many of you, my dear listeners, know, OMD Ventures is a company that I started last year, and in the hopes of growing the platform further, I created a donations page at omdventures.com/stakeholder. That's STAKE holder. On the page, I list out all the various free ways you can support the platform, but if you wanted to provide a little extra help, I've included a donation option, and so this is a new feature I've created. And practically the way it works is that you can practically buy me a cup of coffee. And why a cup of coffee, you might wonder? Well, it's because the podcast started from me having a ton of coffees with very interesting people, and that's how I learned and dissected all these cool information. And I figured, well, instead of having you buy my guests a cup of coffee by taking them out and meeting them one-on-one, it's like I do it on the podcast already. So I figured, hey, why don't you help me out and buy me a cup of coffee and think of it that way. It's like this, I'm the broker of this coffee and you're getting a chance to meet all these people and hear their stories. So practically that was the story behind the donation being a cup of coffee. And so, yeah, I would really appreciate it if you can help support the podcast in any way. And if you would like to donate, I'd be really happy for your donation. And so if you become a coffee donator, then I'll include you into a select group of individuals who can submit questions to me, and I'll provide an exclusive recording of the questions I answer. I haven't decided yet if it'll be quarterly or monthly, but I think based on how the donations come about, it'll continue to evolve and develop. So yeah, check it out at omdventures.com/stakeholders, and just go to the omdventures.com page. Just find the various cool stuff that I have, and the links are all in the descriptions below. All right, cool. So today's guest is David Cairns. He is the Vice President of Office Leasing at CBRE Canada and the co-founder of CBRE Forward. CBRE is a commercial real estate service company. And with my own limited experience of commercial real estate, David thankfully just creates a picture of the real estate value chain for me early in the podcast. So if you're confused like me, it's perfect. We kind of go through what the company does as well as what David specifically does as well. But prior to his successful real estate career, David was a professional poker player. And having been raised by a single-parent household with an entrepreneurial father, David really learned to be an independent competitor really early. And this transpired from being like a competitive skier when he was in school to then eventually becoming this competitive poker player where he earned, I think it was more than $200,000 while he was in university. And so in our chat, we explored the 16-hour daily grinds that people don't see on TV when they watch poker players on sports channels. And we also talk about the emotional roller coaster that resembles like a venture capital career on steroids, because you're practically just going through this huge volatile swing of ups and downs that people in kind of like startup investing would experience over a 10-year period, but you're a poker player experiencing everything condensed in a 1-year period. And we also talk about how this particular experience, his journey, allowed David to really rise from entering the real estate world in an administrative position to becoming a successful VP in real estate and also reestablishing himself as an entrepreneur, where he helped create CBRE Forward within the company as well. And so this was a super fun chat where we explore the various, I think, ins and outs of the poker industry and what it really means to be a poker player, as well as the real estate world as well. And so I hope my chat with David really expands your perspectives and really has you question the default and inspires action in your life. So I really hope you enjoyed our chat. Hey everyone, welcome back to Accounted For. Today on the podcast we have David Cairns. Hey David, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited.
Yeah, and we are in a wonderfully swanky, nice boardroom in CBRE's office, where David here is the Vice President of Office Leasing and he's also the co-founder of CBRE Forward. And so David, for our audience members who are not familiar with the company CBRE, as well as what CBRE Forward specifically is, can you kind of walk us through what you guys do and also what VP of Office Leasing really is?
Absolutely. So CBRE is the largest commercial real estate services firm in the world. We are something like 70 or 80,000 employees and in more than 60 countries. We do anything that you could think of when it comes to commercial real estate services. So we operate in the spaces of office, industrial, retail, hotels, apartments, like any asset type that you could think of, we're there. And then we also do a lot of other things to help our clients, whether it's project management, facilities management. We're a very, very strong and big conglomerate of real estate services that anyone, if you have any real estate need, we service it.
Okay, so you have the full vertical that you provide services to.
Yeah.
And that includes like ownership of the buildings as well? Like, do you own all that?
We actually don't own, but we would manage on behalf of people who own. Companies who own, pension funds who own, institutions who own. So CBRE currently does not own anything. We're a publicly traded company. We are at the forefront of change in our industry for sure. We're making a lot of investments in technology. We just bought a company called Floored, which is a three-dimensional space planning and sort of visualizing tool for companies. So really works well if you are a company like Amazon and you've got a development site that you're considering, but you don't know what it would be like, to be in the building. So you can leverage a platform like Floored to be able to take a virtual tour of everything all the way down to different furniture settings. So it gets pretty specific. So that's just sort of one example of many examples that we're trying to stay ahead of. We also just launched a flexible office space platform called Hana. I'm not sure how people say it, but
how's it pronounced?
Hana. I believe it's called Hana. It's coming out of the US, and that's meant to service flexible office space needs and like events and different things like that. So it's there's definitely a real shift in the office space landscape towards more flexible space, space that has more amenities, more experiences considered with the space, like thinking more like a hotel than maybe a hands-off real estate service provider. So CBRE is also dipping their toe in the water in that as well. So that's CBRE as a company. And what I do is office leasing. So the way I like to describe what I do is I help companies from scale up all the way through to enterprise create dynamic office environments. So I either do that through helping them with transactions, where I'm helping them negotiate, a lease, an expansion, a renewal, a sublease, entering into a different city, anything that might be transactional related to their need for growth or shrinking, hopefully not shrinking, but also in the case of shrinking, we help out too on the transaction side. And then I kind of look at myself as a conduit to the CBRE platform. So if the company needs help with workplace strategy before they actually start looking at sites to go and tour, or they need help with project management as they're going through the construction or the move process, or their culture is going to be impacted by an office move and they need some help with change management, I'm kind of the conduit to connect them to the broader service platform that CBRE has to offer. So that's what I do on a day-to-day basis. I'm also the co-founder of CBRE Forward, which is a platform that showcases the stories of Canada's innovation ecosystem. So that has literally that focus of meeting and talking with the founders and the CEOs and the senior leaders of Canada's fastest growing companies and getting them to talk about, what their challenges are, what their exciting opportunities are, where they see Canada's tech ecosystem going, how environment contributes to success, things of this nature. So that's what the purpose of CBRE Forward is.
Got it. And you briefly touched upon how the future workplaces are changing to become more like co-working space oriented, more hoteling oriented, and less so much as, we're going to commit to 5-year leases. How has that impacted what you do as someone who's actually in office leasing, and what's like the before after picture that you can kind of paint for us?
So that's a great question, and there is no after to paint yet.
Right.
There's definitely a before.
The before and the current, I guess.
Yeah, before and the current. So the best way that I can describe the change is twofold. One is that I think companies really need more from their real estate to be able to attract and retain people. Real estate has become either something that's going to work for you or against you in that regard. Whereas if you go back in time 20, 30 years, you just see these cube farms of it felt like, I don't know, not a great environment, right? Almost like a cell block or something like that. I think that time has kind of come and gone, and people see the value of real estate in terms of that attraction and retention. And also because people are so much more mobile in their ability to perform their job. Like for me, I use my cell phone for probably about 90% of what I do, and I have team members that can help me with things that might need a computer, but a good portion of what I do can be done literally from my handheld device, and many people are in the same boat. So if that's the case, what is the draw to actually come into the office? What's the company doing to actually provide the types of different settings that people might want to have a collaborative meeting or quiet thoughtful conversation with themselves inside their own head, or there's so many different settings that trigger a different response in terms of the work and the output. And I think that experience and that thoughtfulness behind real estate is something that's really changed, and I think that's really awesome. And the people that I think are leading the charge, or the companies that are leading the charge in that regard, happen to be what we would call flexible workspace providers. Companies like Convene, who I'm hugely a fan of Convene, and then other players in the space like Breather, WeWork, Spaces, which is a brand of Regus. All of these providers have been spending probably a lot more time on the experience side of real estate than perhaps the landlords who own the buildings and lease them and know the underlying principles of how to operate a great real estate company, but haven't necessarily thought about that experience piece as much. So that's been a big one. And then there's also been this demand for more flexible space. So companies often have been forced into lease terms that just were longer than what they would have probably wanted to agree to in the first place. And it's pretty hard in really tight office markets like Toronto or Berlin or New York City to have a lot of leverage with landlords. They're going to want longer lease terms than you want. But this rise of co-working or flexible space has created an opportunity for that to change, and that's coming twofold. It's coming from like a macro level where these providers growing is signifying to the market that flexibility is important, and their ultimate expansion is also really giving more opportunities for companies to actually get the flexibility that they want. I think one of the big things that we're seeing right now is right now the co-working providers that are out there typically are offering you a piece of a floor that's part of a broader floor plate where you're going to see a lot of different companies that you're kind of coexisting with. You might have your own private space, but you're coexisting with them on the same floor. So that works for some companies, but when you get to a certain size or a certain scale, or if you're working on something that you might want a little bit more privacy for, that model doesn't really work very well. So the shift in flexible space that's happened lately has been towards privatization of flexible office space. So providers that are out there that are kind of at the forefront of doing this are probably Notel and Breather. These providers are leasing space anywhere between like 2,000 to maybe 30, 40, 50,000 square feet in some cases, where they're building it out for the company, taking into account experience, like I mentioned, different settings that people might want to work in, whether it's a phone booth, whether it's a collaborative space, place to meditate, whatever it might be. They're taking that experience into the equation and providing flexible space. So that's really one of the main trends that's changing as it relates to office space these days.
Got it. And so if I were to paint this if I were to create a value chain of how things are progressing. So if one end, on like the left side of the spectrum, there's me, and I let's say my company grows and I have like 30 people, and that'd be amazing. And so now I'm like, okay, now I want office space. And on the other end of the spectrum, like if I was to look on the right side, there's the landlord who let's say it's, for example, like Brookfield,
Mm-hmm.
and then there's the flexible workday provider like Breather or Convene or like WeWork,
Mm-hmm.
and then do you get slotted in between that, like between me and like the flexible workspace provider,
Yeah.
CBRE, and David, who now listens to what the kind of office I want to create and the kind of ambience I want to have, the kind of culture I want to create, and then tries to like match it up with what we could do.
So thank you for actually bringing me back to your the full part of your question. So yeah, the answer is we would work on your behalf in each of these cases. So me as a service provider to you, I'd be going out and trying to find you, a bunch of different options. Maybe it's a sublease that has, furniture and build out already in place. Then I would maybe find you a space that's direct with the landlord that you could use as a comparison. And then we put in front of you maybe 2 or 3 different what we call flexible or co-working options for you to evaluate. And then on your behalf, I'm helping guide you through, what makes the most sense for your business needs, either from a cost, from a culture, from a privacy. There's a whole range of different factors that matter to different businesses. So it's evaluating which ones make the most sense, which type of space offering makes the most sense. And I'd get involved in every one of those different types of conversations to negotiate on the client's behalf. The question will become over time, how much of the conversations between, let's say, a flexible work provider and a customer are going to happen directly. Today, a lot of them are actually happening directly. And I think that, at least in the current climate, that's a mistake that a company is making. I find that often, and WeWork's the best example of this. They've created an amazing brand. They've just done such a great job of marketing their company. And as a result of that, I think that the companies end up looking at buying from WeWork in the same way that they look at like buying a t-shirt. They're like, oh, the t-shirt's $30, the office is $1,000, and they just often just take what has been presented to them in the first place. It's not to say that in every instance that there's tons of room to negotiate, but often there actually is. And often there's a more creative way of looking at, getting connected to a co-working provider. And I think that companies really need to be a little bit more cognizant of that. And I think, there's a lot of reasons you could probably point to as to why they might go directly to the provider. One, it's that they market really well. 2, a lot of times people have had a bad experience with a salesperson or a broker in a real estate situation, and I totally get that. But just like anything, sales brings a lot of people because there's a low barrier to entry. If you're working with someone that's not that great, maybe doesn't have your best interest in mind, it doesn't mean you shouldn't use somebody. It just means you should work a little bit harder to try to find the right person to work on your behalf.
Perfect. Yeah. And we've been talking about real estate for a while, but for the guests who are not familiar with your background, before this real estate foray, you were a professional poker player.
Yes.
And so before we dive into how that weird transition happens, when we first met, you told me about how, for the most part of your, I guess, childhood growing up, you were raised by your father, like it was a single parent household.
Yeah.
And you mentioned about how you felt like you had to grow up faster than other people. You got to see the grown-up world, the adult world, both faster. And so growing up in Toronto, like what was that like as a kid? Like how did you really feel that? Like how did you notice that you were growing up faster than people around you? And did you feel the distance when you were growing up?
So it's a great question. So my dad raised my brother and I, which is obviously pretty atypical. Normally you wouldn't see in a single parent situation the father raising the kids. I'm eternally grateful to him for everything that he did for us and the fact that he took on that responsibility. I think a byproduct of that, though, was that he did have a lot of career responsibilities and career obligations. And I think by the time I got to be, 13 years old or whatever the age was, and I was a little bit more self-sustaining, it became a little bit easier for him to be able to do, things on his own, and also maybe have a social life too, right? So as a result of, that dynamic, my dad kind of like being the sole care provider for us for like over a decade and having to balance, work and his personal life. At that time, I started to end up spending either more time on my own with my brother, or I was ending up in more adult situations, like I might be going to a party or something that my dad was going to. And in some cases, I probably shouldn't have been at that party, which is okay. I don't hold anything against my dad for that. I actually just kind of look back on it and think that it was incredibly valuable, because what I got to do is spend time actually around a lot of senior executives. My dad was a senior real estate executive, and I just got to spend a lot of time around people that, were really smart, were at the top of their game in their respective careers. And that I didn't really know at the time, but now I see how relevant that was to me being able to build rapport, trust, credibility with the type of people that I now call clients, because those people that I now call clients were a very similar archetype to the people that my dad was friends with. So that's one aspect of it. And then, the time that I spent on my own with my brother, I kind of acted almost like a guardian in some respects to him. And we did a lot of things on our own, and we got definitely into a lot of trouble along the way. But I think that experience too helped me grow up. And then just some of the challenges that come from, I guess, the divorced sort of family dynamic that I had. A lot of those factors just led to me having to take on more adult responsibilities, I think, at an earlier age. So a lot of people could maybe, some people might feel bad for themselves in one way or another because of some pain they might have experienced through that kind of upbringing. I don't look at it that way at all, because I'm eternally grateful, like I said, to the upbringing that I got from my father. I'm so happy with who I am today. So if I'm happy with who I am today, a lot of that came from how I was raised. So that's kind of the way that I look at it. And I don't really overanalyze any one situation where I might have experienced pain or whatever the case may be. I'm just very happy with how I grew up as a result of that. And then that led me to poker. Mm-hmm. And poker, man, that got me to grow up like a lot. So
when is there like a specific kind of moment that you kind of reminisce back on, where you're growing up and you just feel, as you're going through this experience, I would say more rarer than the traditional kind of experience where you're forced to kind of grow up earlier, be more independent, take care of yourself, where you felt like you had like a mindset shift from maybe like a majority of your friends, where you might have felt like, why are people not all like this? Why don't they think like me? As I kind of give you some time to think about it, I ask because when I immigrated, so I was born in South Korea, I immigrated to Hong Kong, and when I moved there, I didn't speak Chinese, I didn't speak English, but I went to a British elementary school, and I had to live apart from my mother for a while because of some family situations, but that was a very difficult time, but because of that I had to learn to be extremely independent, and I never understood why I was so independent and so obsessed with being very self-sufficient. Mm-hmm. And as I look back, I'm like, I think that probably was a very big thing, where that moment where I didn't speak the language, I was getting bullied by people from another country, I didn't have my mother, and that kind of translated into this idea of I always have to be on my own and having to be very self-reliant and self-sufficient. So I'm wondering for you, as you were growing up, if there was some moment when that kind of formulated.
So it's funny, you're making me think of it like a little bit of a tangent to your question. I'll try to preface it. So when I was growing up, I think I was quite confused at different points. My mom came back in and out of my life at different points. And that was really hard for me, I think, when I was especially young, between 9 to 11 and stuff like that. And I was always a bit of a class clown in school, looking for attention. And I really think I wanted a place to fit in because I didn't always feel safe at home, right? Just given, the dynamic that I kind of grew up with my mom coming in and out, and my dad having a career and having different nannies that were taking care of us and stuff as a result of my dad needing the support. But anyway, in I think grade 11, I used to be a bit of a bully, actually. And I really just did it to fit in. And I think I did it also as a way of outwardly getting my pain off my chest. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But it really didn't ever feel right to me. But when you're a young kid, you don't really analyze everything that's going on as it's happening. But I was in a class once and I was making fun of somebody in the class, and someone stood up for that kid that I was making fun of, and basically just said to me, man, like, you are like such a jerk. Like, what the hell is wrong with you? Why do you do this on a daily and weekly basis? Like, it's just not a way to be. And he did this in front of everyone in the class. And it really struck me. Like, it just made me realize, like, wow, I'm not acting in accordance with my values. I'm not acting in accordance with who I am. I'm not a bully. Like, it's not who I am. I'm actually a very caring and kind person. And I immediately kind of transitioned the way that I was treating people. And to me, that's sort of just one of the crowning moments for me. But you're talking about, I mentioned that I'm very independent and I had to grow up early. I think all of these experiences, I can't really point to one, but like all of them led me down this entrepreneurial path of poker. Do you know what I mean? The good and the bad. I sort of was on the sort of like arguably negative side. Like, I had some addictive behavioral tendencies. I liked action. I was competitive. I was a competitive ski racer growing up, and I really loved individual competition, and I loved to win. And I had that like kind of desire for like a rush. So that was like both good and bad. And then I think that a lot of people wouldn't have invested their time into something that really didn't have a very clear outcome. You know what I mean? Like, whether I was going to succeed or fail at that was very much up in the air. And I did experience quite a bit of ridicule in one way or another, whether it's from a family member or a friend, like, oh, you play poker, like you can just imagine how many different negative connotations people would have for something like that. And I think that entrepreneurs face that a lot of the time too, right? Somebody is, telling them they can't do something, or that their idea is stupid, or whatever the case may be. So I just think like all those early experiences that allowed me to grow up and also, watch successful people do what they do, all those things together led me down that kind of entrepreneurial path at a much younger age. And, I don't know where you're going next with the conversation, but you and I talked in the first time that we met about how when I was like 21 and I was getting out of university, I knew that I wanted to play poker, and luckily I had the ability to sustain myself to do that because I had made a lot of money from that, while I was in university. But I had this level of certainty around what I was doing at that time. And I was 21 at the time. I'm now 32. I have never gotten that certainty back to that same level. You know what I mean? Like, I have a lot of certainty around what I do today, but nothing close to when I left university and knew that I wanted to compete at poker for, an undetermined amount of time. But so, yeah.
Continuing on that topic, though, do you feel that you don't feel that certainty anymore because of whether, like, do you think it's an opportunity thing where you just haven't found something that drives that, or do you feel that it's rather that from the life that you've led, where you've experienced more and more, like as a 21-year-old, your world would be, I would imagine, much smaller than the 32-year-old who you are now, where your life is completely different. So then it kind of goes along with like a very famous saying of like, the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know. And so I'm wondering, do you feel that that's like a bigger part of why you don't have that kind of conviction anymore?
I definitely think part of it is that, and that's definitely a path we can go down for this conversation. I'm sure you could go down for a long time. I think part of why I had so much certainty at the time had to do with the fact that poker's a little bit more black and white than a career. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's really just a question of like how far up that ladder of financial success you can get with poker, but the game is the same. You're kind of rinsing and repeating the same process over and over again. Whereas a career, there's so many more like inputs to it. Like you could go to this company or that company and like start with this job and like go to that job. And like I just kind of like, when I thought of leaving poker and getting into like a career, it gave me like a ton of anxiety because I just had no idea where to start, right? But with poker, and I think kids could probably relate to this too, right? Like when you pick a sport that you're playing, there's more of a structure that's understood as to how you're going to interact with that sport or how you're going to interact with that game. And I think that is part of what gave me the certainty, is just knowing what to expect, generally speaking, from the game. Now, of course, there were many things that I did not expect, but they never really had to do with the game itself. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I think it's perfect that you touched upon that because I recently listened to an interview by David Epstein. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he's a sports and science writer. He wrote for Sports Illustrated, and he's also like an author as well. But he talked about how a lot of psychology tests and things like the 10,000 hour rule and like the work by like Anders Ericsson, they all focus on sports. And the flaw with that is that it's a fixed environment. There's only a set number of variables, like you talked about in poker, which is relatively black and white, like with sports as well. You know if you've won or not, and it's very clear. You've won, and the game's over. You go to the next game. But careers and life it's a wild environment where there's constantly different kinds of variables that cannot be controlled. And so because of that, it makes it very difficult to overlay psychological studies on sports over into career and everything else, where the environment you're playing is completely different. And so when you were in university, like you went to McGill to study like poli-sci and marketing, and you learned poker there, like you discovered this passion, this conviction, then how did you come across it?
So in the mid 2000s, there was a bit of a boom in poker. A guy named Chris Moneymaker won the World Series of Poker in 2003. And he was the first person to have ever qualified through an online poker website for a small amount of money into the main event at the World Series. So he like entered a satellite for $30 and ended up winning a $10,000 seat. He then went on to carry that $10,000 seat to a $2.5 million win in the most coveted bracelet in the poker world, which is the World Series of Poker main event. So you pair all that experience with his name, Chris Moneymaker.
Is that his actual name?
It's his actual name, and I've actually been in an elevator with his father, and I asked him. I said, "How the hell is your name Moneymaker?" And he said, "Well, actually, we're German, and going way many generations back, people's last names were their actual trade, and we were coin makers. So our name in German was coin maker, and when we moved to the United States, it just phonetically translated into moneymaker. So that's why we have the name." And so I was like, "Man, you don't understand. Like I'm sure you're all like, loving this. Your son wins the main event, and his name's Moneymaker. Like, what kind of more of a perfect story is that? Amateur player with the name Moneymaker." So that just created this boom in poker, and I kind of was part of that boom towards the end of high school. A lot of it was playing home games with friends. I was the competitive, future entrepreneurial type guy who was actually organizing these games and, really wanted to play often. And my friends were kind of just sort of along for the ride, part of the boom. So eventually they got bored of me and they didn't really want to run these games anymore. And then that's when I started to get into playing online, because there just wasn't a consistent way for me to play and learn the game through my friends. And it just kind of dovetailed into going to university, where I had way less boundaries and people monitoring me. And that's kind of how I started playing.
And what was the initial draw, or not even the initial draw? What kept you constantly in it? Was there like something similar to like the thrill you had from skiing downhill that was there every time you won money? Mm-hmm. Like I'm relatively not as familiar as you, but like I one of my guilty pleasures is to go to the casino when I'm back home in Vancouver, because I live relatively close to the River Rock Casino. Yeah,
I love the River Rock. I came 10th in the BC Poker Championships in 2009, I think it was. It was actually like the most gut-wrenching day of my life.
Yeah.
There was like 800 players in the tournament, and I came 10th. First was like $350,000. Anyway, so the River Rock has anyway.
And it's one of those places where you see all kinds of, foreign money being played, and like my game of choice is blackjack, and so I play blackjack for about 2 to 4 hours just sitting down, and it's true, like the rush that you get from winning, hitting it, and so I'm wondering, like was that the constant pull that you got?
So I think actually it does have actually a connection to skiing. What I loved about skiing is the way that you can win the race. Do you know what I mean? Like it's very pure in that sense. Like your time down that course is going to be what determines, and it's very black and white. So there's something about black and white that I really liked, and I think it was maybe just due to the fact that I had a lot of confusion in other areas of my life. And although what I've always said to people is I find poker to be the most honest thing that I've ever participated in, the most honest world. Not like when I'm playing the game. Poker players outside of the game are not always very honest, but the game itself allows for the most like raw form of honesty to happen, which is that that everyone is trying to deceive you to win. And how honest is that? That that they're trying to lie to you, right? Whereas in life, you're often actually trying to assess whether or not someone is being real with you. Whereas in poker, what someone's intentions are. right?
The default is lying.
The default is lying. The default is try to beat you. And it creates this very honest environment. And it's actually feels quite safe and secure to me. So that's actually part of it. I think I got pulled to the black and white aspects of it because I kind of needed that in my life with a lot of the confusion that I had going on elsewhere. And then it's just the fact that you can win and you can beat everybody. And I just was always captivated by that, just kind of to the skiing example. So I actually didn't play as much cash games in poker where you can kind of come and go. You come and you sit down with $100 or $10,000 or whatever the buy-in is, and you can win money and then leave and come and go as you please. I was never really as captivated by that. I was captivated by tournaments where everybody starts with the same number of chips and you're trying to win the event. So I just was enthralled with that. And, when I was 21, 22, I didn't care about money. It was great that I was making money at it, but I just loved entering a poker tournament. You know what I mean? It didn't matter whether the tournament was $10 or $5,000. I just wanted to win the tournament. Eventually, as time went on, I started to lose some of that passion for the game. But at that time, like I mentioned to you, when all my friends were wondering what am I going to do when I get out of university? Am I going to go work at Deloitte or am I going to go work, here or there? Luckily, I was, I don't want to say luckily, but I happened to be around a group of really smart people. So their choices were like, yeah, am I going to go work at Deloitte or CIBC or whatever? But they were all really, I think, quite confused by it all and thinking I don't know if this is the right path for me, right? I got the opportunity to get to know myself so much better over the course of 3 or 4 years as a result of this sort of non-traditional path that I took. And I learned incredible lessons about entrepreneurship, highs and lows of all that. I put myself in some personal danger in some ways that I won't get into over this podcast, maybe offline. But all of these experiences that I had, I think matured me to a much greater extent by the time I was about 25 and I got into the real estate industry. And I've been pretty successful at it. And I do think that that's part of the reason why I've had success in a relatively short amount of time is sort of that non-traditional background.
Mm-hmm. And I am a huge fan of people with non-traditional backgrounds. And it is one of the principles that I have where I believe that you have to explore. And it's kind of more of the preferred route, in my opinion, to actually get to know who you are better. Mm-hmm. And so when you were 21, coming out of university, I think you said how you had around you earned about $200,000 worth of winnings from playing poker, and so that's a sizable amount of money for someone just coming out of university, but still to make the decision, you might have had conviction yourself, saying, you know what, yeah, I've earned $200,000, I'm probably pretty good at it, I'm gonna go full time at it. What was the response from your father and your friends and everyone around you?
Yeah, great question. So my dad and I struggled a little bit more throughout my university career with poker. I think I mentioned to you in our first meeting, I wasn't the type of poker player that was very methodical with bankroll management. I was always kind of trying to play in the highest buy-in games that I could with whatever available resources I had. Now, that wasn't very smart of me. It led to me going broke many, many times over the years, over the first few years of university. But what I did get out of it was I got to learn how to play in higher pressure situations with players that were a lot better than me. And I knew that was really the only way for me to go about it, and that eventually I would break through and have success, but I wouldn't be able to know how or when. It wouldn't be incremental, you know what I mean? It wouldn't be I started 2 years ago with $50 in a poker account, and then 2 years later I had $200,000. I had a feeling it would be more meteoric, and that is what it was for me. I had a couple of different encounters where I made a lot of money. There was one period where a couple days in a row I made $60,000, and then my friend and I ended up winning a poker tournament with more than 8,000 players in it for $220,000 US, which at the time was I don't know, 260, 270. So I was shooting kind of for whales or whatever, if it's his sales analogy, you instead of going for a small medium-sized business, I was going to try and get Amazon to be my client or whatever. So I think that approach led to a little bit less of I wasn't stable-minded about, if my dad would have been listening to a 20-year-old kid talking about the way that he was playing poker, he probably would have thought, this kid's not very methodical about what he's doing right now, right? And then it was, of course, interfering with my studies. So it was really more as I was evolving and getting to the point where I had become successful with poker that I struggled with my family. My friends, the ones that were closest to me, they liked me for other reasons, right? They poker was a side of me, and I think probably it was an inhibitor because I was so obsessed with it at certain points to a friendship. But I was pretty fortunate that people were accepting of what I was doing. By the time that I got into poker professionally, I'd been a lot more methodical about it. I ended up getting a financial backer who protected me basically from any financial risk. I was actually putting my money to the sidelines, playing with his money. And the reason that I did that is I knew that poker wasn't going to be the path that I wanted to take into my late 30s, 40s, 50s. I was fortunately self-aware enough to know that even if I was successful at poker, even if I was financially successful at poker, I probably wouldn't be happy. And I knew that I would have to sit at the table and earn every dollar just like I had to earn the last one. And I thought I don't want to be 50 and have to be sitting at a poker table grinding it out. I'd love to have a team maybe that's working with me, and I'm making money by potentially adding value to other people who are in turn, in exchange, I'm making some money through them being a part of my team or something like that. That was sort of the mind frame that I had. So I ended up taking an investor so that I could go and play in the highest buy-in tournaments that you could find basically around the world, both live and online. That's why I did it. I didn't need it to play online. I could have sustained making a living, probably depending on the year, I could have made something like 70, 80 to as much as 200 grand a year just playing online poker. But that wasn't the path that I wanted to take. So to just go back to circle up on your question, what do people think about it? It was probably a little bit more challenging for me while I was coming up because I didn't do it in a very methodical way. But by the time I had achieved success, and then I went out and got someone to sort of secure my risk, at that point, I think people were realizing that I was doing it in a more methodical way than the way I started.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so this idea of, so I never knew about this until I watched, I think, a documentary of Daniel Negreanu, who talked about, I think it was a side comment of how some poker players will, bankroll, fund other upcoming poker players, just like how some hedge fund managers will help other small hedge funds grow.
Yep.
And is that a common practice in the industry? And is that what young talent, young poker players look for, where they want that kind of financial safety net and someone who can maybe mentor them or just give them the financial support to continue playing the game?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know a lot about it in the contemporary sense, i.e. today, because it's been a while since I was in the game. But at the time that I was in the game, backing, it's called backing, that's the sort of colloquial term for it, it was everywhere. So if I can go back to the history of the game and how there was this boom, when Chris Moneymaker won the World Series of Poker, it did kick off this boom. A lot of it ended up finding its way to online poker. And essentially, so many people that had very limited knowledge or ability or skills were playing for more money than they should have been. And it works like a capitalist economy. All of the money just kind of rose to the top, right? The players that had no shot, that were depositing $50, losing it, went up to the next level, where the players were a little bit better, and those players took it from that player, and so on and so on and so on until it got literally to the top of the game, right? And those players that were at the top of the game at that time were making money hand over fist because there was a massive knowledge gap. Even at those levels, there was still an incredible knowledge gap between, the good players in a game and the bad players in the game. So at that time, it created this environment where, there was just a lot of froth, where someone who was playing in the high stakes cash games in the world, like my backer, it made it very easy for them to go and back poker players for tournaments because, they were potentially, the guy that I was backing, or that was backing me, he was a multi-millionaire at 23 years old. He's I don't know what he actually had, but he probably had somewhere between $5 to $8 million in cash, right? And he was consistently making money playing cash games at the time. So for him, he's okay, I'll back 5 players, maybe overall in a given year, I might lose a few $100 grand, I might make a few $100 grand, maybe I'll hit it big if one of them wins the main event at the World Series of Poker. But that swing of 200 up, 200 down didn't really matter to that player, right? Because they were one of the best in the world and they were making money hand over fist. But as time went on, just like technology impacts other industries, online, the training ground that became possible online really changed the game. So like, people started to create websites that were for training, where they were doing instructional videos and content and like books. Like there was just so much information that started to flood its way online, forums where people are exchanging information, Skype, study groups, like all of these things made the game harder over time, which ultimately led to a more challenging environment, which led to less money available for backing. That was at least what was going on by the time I had left the game. Backing is definitely still a thing, but I think that because the poker economy is kind of like sort of leveled out, for lack of a better word, I think that there's just probably like the guys who are doing it are more methodical about it. They're not just like handing money to somebody that they don't really know if they have that much ability. Back then, players, my backer wasn't really coaching me. I would imagine most backers today are probably coaching their players. Like he just didn't really care. Like I said, 200 up, 200 down didn't really matter to him, right? Mm-hmm. So I think today it's probably a more methodical and systemized environment, for lack of a better word.
Gotcha. And so then, if you could kind of indulge me on how, you've kind of briefly touched upon what a cash game is, and that didn't excite you. What is then? How does a tournament work? You said there's 8,000 people, and then there's usually, at the end is a winner. And I've watched a bit of poker, and when I watch it, they usually only just show the final table, mm-hmm. where it's just 7 people. Mm-hmm. But I'm guessing then when you have 8,000, it's just a bunch of tables out there. And is it played over like number of days? Like how does it actually work?
Yeah, so you're bringing up a great point. Watching poker on TV can often be extremely misleading. Like you see these massive sums of money and these 7 people sitting around the table, and you just have no concept of what it took to actually get there. It's incredibly difficult. I think I can't remember my stats. I think the times that I would win a tournament were something like 1.5 or 2% of the time, maybe like 1.5% of the time. So every time I entered a tournament, the amount of times I would actually win it is like almost like 1 in 100. Do you know what I mean? And the amount of times that I would cash in the tournament, like make the bottom end of the pay scale, which is usually around somewhere between 10 to 20% of the field, depending on the tournament and the tournament directors and whoever's running it, or the online site that's running it. But in that regard, I was probably cashing between 15 to 17% of the time. What I thought was an impressive stat for me was that when I cashed, I made the final table 1 in 3 times. And when I made the final table, I came in the top 3 1 in 3 times. Wow. So those stats are good, and those stats are very important, because if you don't have stats like that, you're not going to make money. Because most of the time you enter a tournament, to the point you made earlier, there's, there could be 500 people in it, there could be 200 people in it, there could be 8,000 people in it. It's always varied depending on whether it's a live event or an online event, or the size of the buy-in. There's so many factors that lead to a different field size. But either way, most of the time you enter that tournament, call it 85% of the time, roughly 85 or 80% of the time, you're going to lose your buy-in, right? And you won't even come close to making it to the final table. So what you see on TV is literally like the top point whatever percent of the field. So that's literally the hardest part to get to, and the part that you don't get to very often.
And so then when you first start out, there's like 800, let's say, in the tournament. And so there's maybe like 7 people in your table, and there's a bunch of tables, all with 7 people. So you have to, is it like kind of a overall kind of step progression where there's one winner per table, and then all those people get aggregated to a next round of tables like that?
So that is called a shootout, and I love that format. It's such a fun format where you have to win your table to advance, and then you get brought to a table where you're there with like 8 other winners or whatever. That's a particular format. It's not the most common form. A normal tournament, you are going to have the tournament director or the online site, through an algorithm, balancing the tables. So as a player is eliminated, they fill the seat, and so on and so on. There are inflection points in the tournament where there actually aren't enough players to fill the seats. So like, you could be down to like, let's call it 4 tables, and there's like 30 people left, and you need 27 to make 3 even tables of 9. So in that case, you'd have 4 shorthanded tables that are in play. So that's like, there's so many interesting nuances to tournament poker in terms of inflection points, and this is a completely different conversation, but the strategy that's involved in deciding like how to make decisions with the stacks that you have, like the stack that you have in front of you versus the stack that your opponent has in front of them, and then the various points at which you are in the tournament, right? Like, are you really early on where it doesn't really matter too much if you bust, like you're very far away from money? Are you on the bubble where you're about to make money but you're not necessarily there yet? There you need to be a little bit more conservative if you have a short amount of chips, or be really, really aggressive if you have a lot of chips, because you can put pressure on people that don't want to bust. On the bubble of the final table, maybe someone doesn't want to bust. There might be 3 players that are playing for the win, 4 players that are trying to play for the top 3, and a couple that are just literally not wanting to bust before the final table. Like, there's all these nuances to deciding how you play against a person depending on all that. But yeah, there's just an incredible number of nuances to all of it. But to go back to your question, it would be very misleading to just put on the TV and look at those 7 players and not have a lot of backstory as to how they got there.
And it seems like you need a lot of mental endurance and physical endurance to withstand even a single tournament. And you talked about your percentage rates, and when you were hot, it seemed like you were able to get into flow. You had that momentum to take it to the end. But to get to that point, you needed to play, I'm guessing, like hundreds of tournaments.
Oh yeah.
And so this ties back again to the media perception of, okay, so I'm seeing all these millionaire poker players. I'm just going to imagine that they're always in Vegas partying it up, and then they're like, I'll just play a tournament and then win it and cash in and leave. But what is the reality actually like? What was it like in like a year? Like, are you just constantly grinding out all over the world, just in tournaments and not sleeping?
Yeah, no. So it's definitely a grind. I mean, one of my biggest regrets is that I didn't travel enough to all the stops when I was young. I was actually just a bit insecure at the time to go like, Australia or wherever else, like without maybe having a friend who wanted to tag along with me. And a lot of my poker friends didn't have a backer, so they couldn't very easily just go play a 10K buy-in tournament in Australia, right? They were mostly playing online with their own bankrolls. But yeah, I'm sorry, I forgot your question a little bit. If you could just maybe...
Yeah, so the question was just around whether, like, what is the lifestyle actually like?
Yeah,
what was it actually like?
Okay. So yeah, it's really very much a grind. There's no question about it. I was playing at the pinnacle of playing. I was probably 6 days a week, most of the time playing online if I wasn't actually traveling to a stop that I was planning for in advance. Or in the summer, we used to live in Vegas and we'd play the World Series of Poker, because for 7 weeks in a row, they just had tournaments every day. So other than that sort of 7-8 week period, you'd just be like deciding which stops around the world you wanted to go to and play. But aside from that, you're playing online. So, most days would be sitting at your computer in your room, having lost, on a Sunday, like Sundays were my biggest days for me. I used to have $8,000 to $10,000 worth of buy-ins on a Sunday online. So I had to make $8,000 to $10,000 just to break even on a Sunday, right?
And that's with your backers' money.
Yeah, that in that case it would have been with my backers' money. Yeah. So I can't really even describe to you how much of a grind it is, and I can't also describe to you how much of a misconception it might be if you see some guy that you think is like, a multi-millionaire like gangster. He's probably not. Most of these people are backed. Most of these people are in what's called makeup, which is money owed to a backer from previous losses. So, you might see a player win a tournament for $1 million, but maybe they had 400, 500,000 in makeup. Do you know what I mean? So they win that event, they immediately have to pay back that full 500, and then they split profits with the backer 50-50. So I would say that, a competent, good tournament player that plays both online and live is probably not making much more than like a few $100,000, like $200,000 to $300,000 a year. And then, it comes with, it's not like the job that, I have here. Like, even though I'm 100% commissioned, the volatility of poker is massive. Like, you could go on a crazy, unpredictable downswing. You know what I mean? Then that could affect your mental state, and you could make poor decisions from there and continue your downswing. So like, you really have to be of stable mind to do it. And a lot of the people that are doing it are young people that are not necessarily of stable mind, but that, have intelligence, ability, and drive and all that. And, they caught a good run for a while, but eventually the game kind of beats them down. Like it's a really tough game to stand the test of time in. And there are people that do it, and I fucking tip my hat to them, because I don't even really understand how you could you could make a life out of poker, just because of how tough it is. It's just so tough.
And for you, when you decided to leave the game at 25, you talked about how the poker world is changing. There was an influx of information, and so the edge that a lot of the existing incumbents had was disappearing, and so you got out of the scene. But what was that decision to get out? Like, you told yourself that you would eventually leave, but to actually commit to it, and having been in one kind of world, like being like an athlete and entrepreneur of sorts for about 4 years, and then now coming to the wild environment, what was that process like for you?
Well, it definitely didn't happen overnight. I kind of, like, the reason I got out of the game was twofold. One, you made some points already that the game was changing a lot. The U.S. government indicted poker stars and Full Tilt for tax evasion, money laundering, wire fraud, and a laundry list of different offenses, and that consequently shut out the U.S. from playing online poker. So that had a real effect on the games, and that was a tangible reason that I started to sort of peel back from it, just because it was harder to make money from it. A lot of the bad players were coming from the US, or the players that we would refer to as fish, or fun players. That's a new term, actually. Since I was playing poker, we used to call them fish. Now they call them fun players.
Okay, I thought it was called patsies.
Yeah, well, they don't actually want to say something negative about that player. They call them a fun player, so that they want to hopefully come back. Because if you're ridiculing the people that you're making money from, that's a pretty stupid, counterintuitive thing to do. Anyway, so that was a tangible reason, but the main reason really for me was just that, like, the game was just emotionally and physically wearing me down. I'm now 170 pounds and a pretty slender man. I was probably like 200 pounds at the time, and just really unhealthy, smoking, drinking, eating bad food, sitting at a desk for 16 hours a day. And then you layer on top of that all the stress that comes from the ups and downs financially speaking, and the fact that I was playing the game at hours that none of my friends were even available to hang out with me. So, like, they would be working during the day, like 9 to 5. I'd be starting at like 3 o'clock in the afternoon, playing till night. And then weekends were my biggest days, because that's when most amateur players were playing online. So eventually all that stuff just started to wear on me. Like, it was having an emotional toll on me. So I just decided, I'm almost grateful that this sort of stuff with the U.S. happened, because who knows whether I would have quit at that time. And I really did need to quit. I didn't need to quit for financial reasons. I actually done well financially, but emotionally I was not doing well. So I kind of peeled back, and still didn't really get a job because I had a lot of money, and that was almost a curse at the time, that I had this money and I didn't have anything driving me to go do something different. I actually then did take a job, like a entry-level sales position at a company called Career Builder, which is like, I don't know what they're doing these days, but they were a competitor of like Monster and Indeed. I didn't really align with that opportunity, and after about 6 months, I quit the job. It was kind of funny. My dad actually quit his first job, and I remember quitting that job. My dad was away overseas, and I remember being kind of like, worried to tell him that I had quit after such a short amount of time, leaving from poker, and I was just worried what he would think of me. He luckily didn't have any judgment for me about it, but I then quit, and then I actually even went back after that to play at the World Series of Poker that summer, and actually it was crazy. I remember I tallied up about $50,000 worth of buy-ins that I wanted to play, and I sold 50% of that action at about 1.3 to 1 markup. So for every dollar that I sold to somebody, they gave me $1.30 back, which was nice. And I remember I just decided that morning, I'm like, okay, I'm going to go to the World Series. I made like 10 phone calls, and I sold the action like in that day.
Wow. And
then I went down and played. Didn't really have a successful summer. And then I came back, and I kind of I'm saying all these things to show what a process it kind of took. I took a job that didn't align with me, got back into poker, kind of like dipping my toe in the water. And then finally, after probably another 4 or 5 months of like coming back from that, I had been through enough emotional change that I was ready to take on a career.
And that process, after that process, now you've been at CBRE for 6.5, like 7 years. 7 years. And you told me how when you first started, you were like an admin assistant position, like you were making like $35,000 a year. Yeah. And from someone who was at, like in a very like successful field where you were making tons of money, money wasn't even an issue, to now coming to a corporate world where you're doing like admin assistant work. You knew you were smart. You were like I could totally, try to understand or even empathize about how, you're smart. You are like a rock star, but to kind of do a job that would, be like very easy for you to actually like fight the ego and like actually be humble about it. How was that process for you to actually like, adjust to that?
Yeah, it was one of the most challenging times in my life. I'm very grateful that I got this year in what we call our sales training program or our research group to basically find myself a little bit. Because when I came into this environment, I like was having panic attacks. Like, you talked about someone who like was at the top of their game or whatever, which like I wouldn't necessarily say I was like I wasn't a top player. In online poker at one point I was for a consistent period there I was in the top 100 online players in the world, which is pretty good because there's a lot of online poker players. But I actually had tons of insecurity. Like I totally doubted myself like a ton, and I just needed time to actually get on my feet and learn how to interact in this kind of a setting, which is literally the polar opposite of poker, right? Where like I was sort of like by myself a lot of the time, or with a group of misfits kind of thing, rather than being in a structured corporate environment where people are, working for big companies. And like it was a really tough transition for me. And I've had periods where I've been arrogant, and it's all been rooted in insecurity when I've been arrogant. But in general, I'm actually a pretty humble person, and I've always been pretty humble. So I didn't have any qualms with starting out making 35 grand or anything like that. I didn't have any qualms with doing administrative work for other people. That I was like totally happy to do, and I wanted to learn the business and just figure it all out. I actually just had more of an internal insecurity in terms of like whether I was making the right decision for myself. Could I actually do the job that I was going to be tasked to do next? All these things were kind of like in my mind a lot. And like I said, this job, it gave me the opportunity to learn the market a little bit slower and get to know a lot of the people that do the different functions that I mentioned at the start of this podcast. Like, our company does an incredible number of things. So being able to be in this environment and learn from all these people and see where my skill sets would be best used while kind of getting my feet on the ground, which they had not been for the last 5 years, that was an experience I needed, and I'm really grateful that I got it.
Yeah. And was there like, as you're going through this journey and now you're in this corporate world and learning that about yourself, learning that about the environment, it's still I would say a vastly different environment from the very intense kind of field that you were in before, like when you were playing poker. And even the business of real estate alone, it has the perception of being slower, being more, people when they think about investing in real estate, they're like, oh, it's a much more stable, secure investment than like equities. Mm-hmm. Now that's obviously a debatable thing, but that's the perception that people have.
Yeah.
And so to be in this world, did you what kind of like process did you have to kind of stick with it and not get bored by it? Like, was there some kind of inflection point where you kind of had an aha moment of, oh, this could work, like I could see myself here, like I could see myself doing this. It may seem different, but I could see myself doing this.
Well, I think I did actually have a backbone for patience, believe it or not. So poker, I did it for long enough that I had sustained a lot of ups and downs. I had seen how much time it would actually take to experience success. And I knew that like success can come in waves, and it doesn't really happen all of a, it might happen all of a sudden, then you might have like a lull or something like that. So I was ready for a lot of the up and down and waiting that I knew would come with this position. So I think that was actually a huge asset to me, that I had gone through this poker experience before. I also had, a father who was in the real estate industry. And although I really could have given two shits about what he did when I was younger, I paid no attention to it. And if he wanted to talk to me about it, I'd tell him to shut up. But I realized as I got into it that I did absorb a lot of the underlying kind of, skills or aptitudes that were necessary to succeed just through my upbringing of learning from him and learning from the people that I got the opportunity to spend time around that were, his friends or his colleagues. So yeah, I actually, funny enough, I look around and I see a lot of impatience from people who come from more traditional backgrounds than me, ones that maybe had a lot less action, a lot less up and down. I knew what I was getting myself into, and it really felt like something that I could actually wrap my head around a lot more, because in poker I was winning and losing money on a regular basis, and you know, if you take the math from the math I gave you on cashing in poker tournaments, you know, roughly 80% of the time I was actually experiencing a loss, and like 3-4% of the time I was experiencing a gain that paid for my losses plus profit. So, you know, you really have to be like patient and have a lot of endurance and you know, be able to sustain pain to be able to actually do that over the course of 2, 3, 4 years. Like even doing it for 2 years is something that I don't think most people would have been able to do playing poker, right? So all those things just made this actually kind of, I don't want to say easy in a way that it sounds like arrogant or something, but I just had the backbone to do it. I had the underlying skills to do it.
Yeah, no, I can totally see what you're exactly saying, and it's like, as you're telling me the experience, I'm imagining it's like you personally were a venture capital fund on steroids, and you went through a 10-year fund in each year, in essence, because you're going through such a huge wave of roller coaster rides, and with your emotions and experiencing constant failure. Whereas a lot of people in the corporate who started out in the corporate world, who were all very type A, did well in school, they might not really experience as much failure. It's because it's such a very gradual process. They won't be able to really handle that kind of emotion, and that might lead to this impatience too.
Failure is like the best thing that could ever happen to a person. You know what I mean? And like, I think it's just knowing that. So I was talking to a group of younger salespeople and interns earlier this week, and I was telling them how I still experience to this day imposter syndrome, which is kind of crazy to think in a way. I've been doing my job for 7-8 years. I know what I'm doing. I know how to consult my clients, but the stakes just kind of get higher as you get more experience. You get in front of, you know, more dynamic deals, more, you know, really smart clients that maybe aren't necessarily startups that you know way more than them. They might know as much as you, you know? So I just find that I'm always making mistakes. I'm always experiencing fear, and I'm always ready for failure. And I think that, like, knowing that and having the courage and the vulnerability to acknowledge the way that I feel, and know that I'm probably not going to lose it. You know, if I'm losing it, I'm probably flat. You know, I'm not really gaining new experience or moving on to something more dynamic, more fun. So,
No, I think that's kind of a perfect spot to kind of leave, I think, our conversation today. And as we kind of wrap up, a final question I kind of want to ask was, so if you could imagine that the 20-year-old David and Miguel, who's getting the confidence and the conviction to be a full-time poker player, what do you think that David's emotional reaction would be to seeing where you are right now in this boardroom that we're doing this podcast?
I think he might cry. You know, like that guy had a lot of potential, and he's a very good guy, but a very lost guy. And I think he would be happy to know that he was going to turn out like me. Because it might not have been so clear at the time. Mm-hmm. You know?
No, that's perfect. And so, was there anything today that we didn't talk about you kind of wanted to maybe brush upon or like leave our audience with?
Well, you've told me that your audience is, you know, maybe not starting their career, but probably getting to that point in their career where they're questioning things. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I would say they're a very curious bunch, and some are, I would say, people who are looking, who are questioning whether they should be doing what they're doing right now, and also just people who are already in careers they might actually enjoy, but also wondering, what do other people do?
I think I'll go back to the story I told about how I was bullying somebody and I got called out for it, and I wasn't aligned with my values, right? I think that people focus often too much with their career on like what's in front of their face or what their experience allows them to maybe do, right? Like, oh, I have an accounting degree, so I'm going to go be an accountant or whatever. The more important thing is to focus and get clear on your values. and the more clear you can get with your values, I think the more fulfilled you will be in your life, because there's always going to be aspects of any job that you do, even one that you're really like well suited to, which I think, you know, we can probably both agree this job I'm reasonably well suited to. But there are times when it's hard, or I don't enjoy parts of it. But if you can get really clear on your values, you know, what they are for you, you're going to be able to get through tougher situations, or be able to experience the joys of situations more too. And you won't really actually define yourself so much by your job vocation specifically. And I think by that actually happening, you'll open up a better opportunity for yourself. You might start doing something for your work that you didn't even think you were possible.
Perfect. David, thanks so much for coming on the podcast and sharing your story with me and my audience. It's honestly been really fun. And yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
All right. Bye. All right. Thank you for listening to the podcast. I hope the story was inspiring to you. Hopefully it also helped you expand your perspectives. Hopefully it also made you question the default path that you might have been going on, or the default beliefs you might have had. And maybe now it'll make you even think about doing something about it, doing something different, maybe challenging yourself, being courageous. Who knows? But regardless, I'm really happy that you took some time out of your day to listen to this fantastic story with my guest. And if you would like to somehow, in some way, contribute and help support the podcast, and maybe even just be part of the community that I'm trying to build with the greater OMD Ventures platform, really think about being a stakeholder in the platform. And the quick way to do that is to go to my website, oldmandan.com, and go to the stakeholders page. I believe it's oldmandan.com/stakeholder. And the link is also down below. And that's how you can figure out how you can subscribe, follow to get more updates on the free content, but at the same time also donate by actually just buying me a coffee. That's just how I put it. And you can buy me a coffee a month, coffee a week, or coffee every day of the year. And think about it as the way that, you know, if you wanted to chat with me, you might just bring me out for coffee and buy me a coffee. Or if you wanted to bring one of my guests out to chat, you might buy them a coffee. So I'm just think of it as I'm the service that's doing that for you, so you can just pay me in coffees. Don't worry, everything will still be free. It would just really help if you would like to show your support this way, so that I can use the coffee money to buy myself actual coffees, and also to buy my guests actual coffees, and use the leftover money to actually grow the platform, as well as even keep it operationally alive as well, because all this isn't really free, and it does take a lot of time to build it as well as operate it, and hopefully grow it further. So your support would be amazing if you would like to contribute. And so yeah, just check out the website, go to the stakeholders page, and read the different kind of benefits you might even get as a stakeholder. All right, thank you.